Muir.
Good morning, everyone. We're coming on the air because there is breaking news. The Supreme Court has just officially issued now one of its most consequential rulings in recent decades. Just moments ago, the court ruling in favor, again, of putting this case back down to the lower courts on the issue of abortion and whether or not women whose health is at risk should be able to have an abortion in the ER. This is specific to the state of Idaho. Of course, this was a challenge to the states after Roe was overturned, and then multiple states no longer made abortion available in their states. I want to get right to Terry Moran because, Terry, as you know, this was leaked yesterday for a time, an egregious error by the court to have it posted online temporarily. We were unclear whether or not that was the official decision, but it looks at this point that it's almost exactly the same as to what we saw yesterday.
Word for word on first and cursory reading, David. It does look word for word, and certainly the result is the same. So this case, as you point out, was a clash between that Idaho state ban on abortion with no exception for the health of the woman. Abortions were legal in Idaho only, under this law, only after rape and incest or to prevent death, necessary to prevent death. That clashed with a federal law that called for anyone who goes into an emergency room in the United States gets emergency care, and the government argued that must include those rare and tragic cases where a woman emergency care means termination of the pregnancy. And in this case, what they have done is they said, we can't decide it right now. And the reason is, although the court doesn't explain itself, Justice Amy Coney Barrett does write and notes two developments that make this wrong to decide now. The Idaho Supreme Court revised its law in an opinion after the court got this case, and the Idaho State Legislature revised it after the court got this case. And so essentially, although they don't explain it officially, you can judge from Justice Coney Barrett's opinion here that what they decided is just too fluid right now. Send it back, let the new case come to them, because this is definitely coming back to the Supreme Court at some point, on the right law, developing the facts with lower court opinions and briefs and dissents, and then we'll take it, is looking like what the court is doing here.
So, Terry, essentially this means this is not a final decision here, but as far as it affects women in the short term, particularly women in Idaho, this means that if their health is at risk, that if they go into an ER in Idaho, that if an abortion is needed, they would be able to get that in the ER.
That's right. Right now, it returns to the original action by a federal trial judge, which put the Idaho law on hold. So women who have those terrible complications that might require the termination of a pregnancy in order to prevent, massive bleeding, renal failure, hypoxic brain injury, all things that might not lead to death, but that are very serious consequences if the pregnancy continues. They will still be able to get an abortion in the emergency rooms of Idaho. They have been helicoptering women out of those emergency rooms to Portland, to other states, because of the concern that doctors could be prosecuted under the Idaho law. In the interim, right now, that Idaho law has been stayed once again, and so the women in Idaho can get the care, the emergency care, that they need, if that includes the termination of a pregnancy in Idaho.
All right, Terry, stick with us. Terry Moran live at the Supreme Court there for us this morning. Of course, this is the biggest abortion case since the court overturned Roe nearly 2 years ago now, which resulted in abortion bans in more than a dozen states. For the first time since that ruling, the court weighing in this morning on the scope of a state abortion ban. It comes about 24 hours, I mentioned, after that document was mistakenly and briefly posted online, but it did turn out to be the actual decision. The case is out of Idaho. It's Moyle versus the United States. And essentially, as Terry just pointed out, it asks if a federal law governing emergency care protects access to abortion at hospitals when a woman's health is at risk. And for now, the court is saying we're going to send this back down to the lower courts. Women whose health is at risk or are risk in particular cases can, in fact, get an abortion at an ER in the state of Idaho. Again, this was a test, the first significant test to these state abortion bans. I want to bring in Rachel Scott, who has covered the issue of abortion rights across the country. And Rachel, first off, people who are trying to fight back against these state abortion bans recognize that this is a temporary victory, with them signaling today that they're going to send it back.
Abortion providers and doctors that I have spoken to are, in fact, calling this only a temporary victory, an emphasis on the word temporary because they are expecting more legal challenges. They know that this law can change once again, and that could spark confusion for women in the state of Idaho. They're also calling this a small measure of justice because it's not just Idaho, David. After Roe versus Wade was overturned, you have 21 states that have severely restricted access to abortion. 14 states have near total bans on abortion. And there are 7 states, including the state of Idaho, that had laws on the books that did not specify an exception to protect or save the health of the mother. And so this morning, you have abortion providers who are saying, well, what about the women in the other states? What about the women that we have talked to that have been pushed to the brink of death, who were turned away and told to come back when their symptoms had worsened? What about the doctors who are leaving these states because they say they can no longer provide the standard of care that they want to provide to their patients in states like Idaho who have these restricted bans? And what about the residents who do not want to practice in these states because of these bans, David?
Rachel Scott with us as well. Rachel and Terry, my thanks to you both. I want to do one more question before we go off the air here to Devin Dwyer, who covers the Supreme Court for us as well. Devin, putting this case aside, we know that there is a presidential debate tonight, the earliest ever presidential debate. So many historic firsts with this. We have 2 presidents on that stage, a current one and a former one. Obviously, this issue of abortion very likely to come up. The issue that has not been resolved by the court and will not be today is this broad issue of immunity that President Trump, former President Donald Trump, has been fighting before the court with these cases involving January 6th and the documents at Mar-a-Lago, whether or not a former president can be criminally prosecuted or whether or not there is total immunity. And we're not going to hear that decision before they get on that stage tonight.
We're not, David. The Supreme Court didn't hand it down today. We don't know whether it will come tomorrow. The Supreme Court also just indicated they won't finish up their work by the end of this week. By tradition, before July, that means they're into next week. But that hugely consequential decision, can a former president be criminally charged, remains unanswered, and the court won't deliver that to us tonight before this highly, highly consequential debate.
All right, Devin, we sure do appreciate it. We'll continue to follow the court. Several significant decisions still to come from this court during this term. Devin, thank you. Our thanks to Terry and Rachel as well. We're going to return you to regular programming. I'm David Muir here in New York. For many of you, it's Good Morning America. And of course, I'll see you later today for World News Tonight. And then, of course, ABC will be carrying the CNN presidential debate right here on ABC tonight. We hope you'll join us for that. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
And we are following that breaking news from the Supreme Court. The High Court has ruled to allow emergency abortion access in Idaho when a woman's health is at risk. The case centered on whether a federal law governing emergency care protects access to emergency abortions, even in states that ban abortions. The justices have opted to send the case back to the lower courts, saying Idaho's abortion law has actually changed since the federal district court decision that the Supreme Court was reviewing. I want to bring in our Washington reporter, Devin Dwyer, for the latest on this decision. Devin, it's kind of a mixed bag here. The justices are blocking or upholding the emergency access to these abortions, but not really deciding on the issues as a whole for now.
That's right, Diane. They did not get into the merits of this case. They simply said they got involved too soon. And in an extraordinary exchange of narratives attached to that very short decision by the court, punting it back down to the lower court, the justices really take shots at each other. There is intense, fiery language between Justice Samuel Alito, who says the court should have taken up and decided this case on the merits, should have struck down this challenge to Idaho's state ban, let them conduct abortions as they see fit. And Justice Jackson, the liberal on the bench, agreeing with Justice Alito, saying they should get into it, angry that the court has now delayed this. In the words of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she says this is not a victory for pregnant women in Idaho or across the country. She calls it a catastrophe. Diane, that's her word. She said the court had a chance to bring clarity to the situation and squander it. And women now in Idaho and a number of other states will continue paying the price. To be clear, Idaho was one of 6 states that that does not allow an exception for an abortion in their ban when the health of a woman is at risk. Only if imminent death is on the horizon can an abortion be performed. And so while today in Idaho there's a reprieve on that front, doctors will be allowed to perform an abortion in an emergency if it's in their medical judgment that one is necessary to stabilize a patient in crisis. But 5 other states don't have that same exception. Those are left untouched, and it will at least be a couple more years, Diane, before this issue certainly will come back to the Supreme Court, and they'll have to tackle this question again.
Brian, in the arguments over this case, there was this interesting debate about a hypothetical of a woman, for example, losing her uterus or another organ as a result of a pregnancy, but that situation not necessarily likely to result in death. And the lawyer for Idaho argued that the law in existence would provide emergency care for most women who needed abortions because of that exception for if needed to prevent the death of the woman. But the lawyer did also admit that in a case where hypothetically a woman could, for example, lose an organ, but death was unlikely, that would not qualify for the emergency abortion. That seemed to be a sticking point for the justices. Now that they're looking at the way the law has changed since this case came to the Supreme Court, what does that do for prospects of this issue coming back before the court again?
Well, I think that both sides will look at this issue again as the law has evolved, and we see in the concurring opinions by Barrett, Chief Justice Roberts, and Kavanaugh that, as you point out, some of the new law, some of the points of the new law have developed to the point that arguments that were made, such as the loss of an organ like a uterus, are issues that need to be revisited and flushed out. I think what's going to happen is that in the new law, they're going to try to make adjustments to how to make that argument as to a major organ, whether it be a uterus, a liver, or something to the effect that you could lose but still live, would be something that needs to be understood and addressed so that we're not having this patchwork of doctors saying, yes, I will perform an abortion because the uterus may be lost, and some doctors saying, no, I won't, because this doesn't affect the life of the individual.
Now, Terry, major medical organizations had warned going into this ruling that abortion bans without exceptions for a pregnant woman's health force doctors to second-guess what qualifies as sick enough to be considered life-threatening. So they argue that women end up waiting for urgently needed care, and that puts them in danger. What does this ruling do for that predicament now?
Well, right now, it essentially takes the doctors off the hook. They can practice medicine, emergency room medicine, for all those tragic cases which are familiar to doctors in emergency rooms, where a woman comes in, the placenta has ruptured, she's got massive preeclampsia, all kinds of things that can happen that might not mean that terminating the pregnancy is necessary to prevent death, but would mean is necessary to prevent renal failure or to preserve her ability to have children going forward. And right now, doctors can still do what is the standard of medical care in those situations, which is terminate the pregnancy. But this issue will come back to the court, as Devin suggested. And when it does, Justice Amy Coney Barrett is going to be a crucial vote. She agreed to send this case back down for further proceedings because it's not ready for a decision. But in her opinion here, she signals what she was concerned about. She says that Idaho raised the concern that the exception, which is for mental health, which they assume would be part of emergency mental health situations, would, in Idaho's words, turn their hospitals into federal abortion enclaves. And the lawyer for the United States, for the government, said, no, there is no standard of medical care in any mental health situation where abortion, terminating a pregnancy, would be the standard of care. So that's a red herring. Amy Coney Barrett says that's important. And then the other thing Idaho was very concerned about is doctors that have a conscience objection. Emergency room doctors who don't want to have anything to do with abortion might be forced to by the federal government. The government, in its briefs and arguments, said no, federal law has plenty of protections for people who have conscience objections. And Barrett said that's really important to her. So she's looking for space around those issues when this issue comes back to the court, as it almost certainly will.
And I want to bring in OBGYN Dr. Jessica Shepard for one of the terms that you use that I think is really important, Terry. Dr. Shepard, I want you to talk about the standard of care and why that is so important in a case like this, where a potential ban or other language in a legislation can conflict with the standard of care and what that means.
You know, when we look at women's health and standard of care, many times that has to do with, at that time, what is looking at the health of the mother, what is the detriment, what is the care that's needed in order to preserve their life, but also the choices that they want to make. So, as you were saying before, this is something that we're going to see that is not really a victory for women, because there's so many sticking points in here that are going to cause chaos and confusion when we look at what is that doctor-patient relationship and what does the doctor feel that they're able to do, which is standard of care versus before this and after this ruling that we've heard today.
And the attorney for Idaho and some critics in general have called into question that the standard of care would call for an abortion in a case that didn't endanger the life of a mother enough that it would already be protected under this Idaho law. Can you speak to scenarios where that might come into play?
Absolutely. So first of all, when women present to the ER, or even if they're on a labor and delivery, or even in a doctor's office, the time span between a woman presenting with something that's going on that become imminent danger to herself can be a very short time frame. So the decision making and the decision process that needs to occur in those time frames, especially when it's an emergency, can create a lot of different moving parts. And that's why it's so important that we really don't have such I guess, nuances with this law, because that's where you're going to miss the time and potentially lose a woman's life as they're looking for care.
And I want to bring in our senior congressional correspondent, Rachel Scott, because, Rachel, this is sure to be a huge political topic. Already was before this ruling came down. So how are the candidates responding?
Yeah, and the reason why, Diane, of course, is because former President Donald Trump appointed 3 of the 5 Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe versus Wade. That cleared the way for 21 states to severely restrict access to abortion and pave the way for the type of abortion bans that we are seeing across the country, because it's really up to the states to decide how they want to restrict abortion access. We are already hearing from the Biden campaign just moments ago. They say that women's health, lives, and freedoms remain in peril across the country because of Donald Trump. They are placing the blame squarely at his feet. As for the former president, well, he does believe in exceptions for rape, incest, and to save the life of the mother. The former president has not said if he also believes in exceptions to protect the health of the mother. I can imagine that could be one topic that comes up on the debate stage tonight. And Diane, you know, I've been covering this issue now for some time, and in our special On the Brink, we talked to many of these women in these states that have been pushed to the brink of death. They told us that they were turned away from their doctors and told to wait until their conditions worsen, until they can even smell their infection in some cases, to come back and to even get the standard of care that the doctors say that they wanted to provide. Those women told us that the problem is not the doctors. They say the problem is the law. And just a few days ago, I was in Arkansas. That is another state that has a near total ban on abortion, talking to providers there, and they tell me they are losing doctors, that they are bleeding doctors in that state because doctors feel like they cannot provide the level of care that they need to for their patients. And they also say that their residents are not being trained on that either. It is something that they are concerned about. When you hear that this just being a temporary relief, what is the long-term impact on the healthcare system in these states with bans as this continues to make its way through the courts, Diane?
And Dr. Shepard, I could see you vigorously nodding as Rachel was talking. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is where we're going to see the confusion is, one, now we're not training future doctors to be able to provide this very critical portion of women's health. And then also on the flip side is this confusion of when do I provide the standard of care and what exactly is it? And will there be implications on a physician and providing care for a woman? I think that those are very critical points that need to be brought up and to have consideration when thinking of what is healthcare, what are doctors able to do for their patients, and what is that parameter in which they can give the best standard of care and not minimizing that.
So, Terry, what happens next here? What's the big takeaway from this ruling?
Well, what happens next is the case will go back down and proceed to the court in the normal way. The law has been changed a couple of times. They'll look at the facts under the law as it is currently constituted. It'll go through a trial court. It'll go through the appeals court, lots of briefs, lots of opinions and dissents. And then at some point, my expectation would be the court would take it again. But the big takeaway, this is life after Roe versus Wade. What we heard in Rachel's reporting, what we heard from Dr. Shepard, this is life after Roe versus Wade. Idaho passed this law with no exception for the health of the mother. Abortion only permitted when it was necessary to prevent death. Those are the words of the Idaho law, necessary to prevent death. They did that based on the values of the legislators, reflecting the values of their constituents, and yet even they have revised their law already to include ectopic pregnancies, are not counted under their definition of abortion. And yet the reality is what you're hearing. There are doctors now facing the possibility of not being able to decide in those urgent minutes that Dr. Shepard was talking about, to care for their patients in the manner that they feel is best, or they might face criminal prosecution, loss of their license, and even prison. And there are women all over the country, but certainly in Idaho, left wondering what is their status in that state when they get pregnant.
And Terry, you touched on this a bit, but I just want to be clear. What is the impact of this ruling in states beyond Idaho that have similar laws on the books?
Well, they are looking to the Supreme Court to decide this conflict between the federal law saying anyone who walks, it's 40 years old, it's been on the books for a long time, anyone who goes into an emergency room in the United States must get emergency care to stabilize their condition at least. This was written to prevent patient dumping, which was happening at the time. The government now argues that that must include the standard of care for these terrible, tragic, rare instances when termination of pregnancy is the solution to an emergency. All those states that have similar laws will still await the Supreme Court's decision on who wins, Idaho's law or the federal government's command.
And Terry, we are still awaiting several key decisions from this court before the end of its term. What are you watching for there?
Well, the two cases that come out of the 2020 election. First, the defendant who joined the mob that stormed the Capitol, who says that he and hundreds of others of defendants have been improperly charged, that the obstruction charge that they have been charged, the obstruction of official proceeding, they argue was written really just for financial and business crimes, and the prosecutors have overreached here. Then that Donald Trump's case is the biggest case of the term. Trump's claim that he is absolutely immune from any criminal prosecution for any acts he took in trying to overturn the 2020 election, including January 6th, because he was acting in his official capacity, he claims, and presidents, he says, are absolutely immune, cannot be prosecuted for anything they do within the outer perimeters of their official duties. That case must be resolved and will in the coming days.
All right, Devin Dwyer, Terry Moran, Rachel Scott, Brian Buckmeyer, and Dr. Jessica Shepard, thank you all. We'll be right back.
Are you ready to celebrate? Sunday, June 30th, across the country. See, experience some of the nation's greatest Pride celebrations all in one place as they happen live right here on ABC News Live. Pride across America. Celebrate joy, love, freedom, and pride. Sunday, June 30th, starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Streaming on ABC News Live and stream on Hulu.
Whenever, wherever news breaks, it's so important to always remember that lives are changed. Here in London, in Buffalo, Uvalde, Texas, Edinburgh, Scotland. Reporting from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Ukrainian refugees here in Warsaw. We're heading to a small community outside of Mexico City, getting you behind the stories as they happen. ABC News Live Prime. We'll take you there.
Stream ABC News Live weeknights wherever you stream your news. Only on ABC News Live.
There is a price to be paid every time a survivor shares their story. I will not be silenced.
Do you feel the church accepted abuse?
I wouldn't say accepted it as so much pretended it didn't exist.
Yep, that's him.
Yep.
Ready? Kira Phillips with ABC News. Does your church protect sexual predators?
The powerful new Impact by Nightline. Secrets of the 2x2 Church.
There's nothing pretty about hearing this.
Now streaming on Hulu.
I'm Anthony Mackie. Like most fishermen, sharks used to terrify me. If the shark gets too close, I should hit it in the nose.
Well, you don't need to hit it.
I'm on a quest to find out why these apex predators, that's amazing, are swiping fishermen's hard-earned catches. What? You saw that?
Shark Beach with Anthony Mackie.
Woo! That's our fish. Look at that.
Part of the sharkiest 4-week celebration this summer. Shark Fest starts Sunday at 9 on National Geographic.
You're watching America's #1 streaming news. Keep streaming with ABC News Live. Why do so many people start their day here?
This is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories. Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards. Start Here, ABC News. Make it your daily first listen, wherever you get your podcasts. Start Here. What does it take to be the most watched newscast in America?
We are part of an operation.
Is this our combat operations center?
We're approaching the gate. Militants came in from different directions.
Nuclear reactor.
So you have a couple loaded and ready to go. The house is destroyed, but the flag...
Not a tear in it.
How important it made the USA.
Great work. Hi. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Ismail? David.
I'm David Muir.
I know who you are.
You
Watch
do?
you every night.
ABC's World News Tonight with David Muir is America's most watched newscast.
Reporting from Arizona's state capital, I'm Elizabeth Schulze. Wherever the story is, we'll take you there. You're streaming ABC News Live.